On a foggy night, a man and his elderly boss stood on a desolate bridge. The air was thick with tension, and the man's voice trembled as he spoke. Moments later, a scream pierced the silence, followed by a deafening splash. Little did he know, hidden in the shadows, a pair of loyal eyes had seen everything. What secrets did this loyal German shepherd witness, and how could his silent presence unravel everything? The bridge loomed high above the river, its rusted railings creaking under the weight of time and neglect. The moon, veiled by thick, ominous clouds, barely cast enough light to illuminate the scene. It was here, amidst the eerie stillness of the night, that Daniel paced nervously, his footsteps echoing against the metal planks. Clutching the old briefcase in his hand, he glanced over his shoulder, his expression a mix of guilt and hesitation. Behind him, his elderly boss, Mr. Whitmore, shuffled closer, his cane tapping rhythmically on the ground. Whitmore was a man of quiet dignity, his silver hair combed neatly back despite the chill wind whipping around him. His frail frame carried the weight of decades of hard work and loyalty, but tonight he seemed oblivious to the danger lurking just a few feet away. He looked at Daniel with the kind of trust that only years of mentorship could build. "Daniel," Whitmore said softly, his voice barely audible over the faint rush of the river below. "You've been like a son to me. I don't know what's troubling you, but we can work through it together." But Daniel didn't respond. His grip tightened around the briefcase as his mind raced. The temptation of the contents inside, an envelope of cash and a signed deed transferring Whitmore's lucrative business, was too much to resist. Whitmore had trusted Daniel with everything, unaware of the growing resentment and greed festering in the younger man's heart. As Whitmore leaned against the railing to catch his breath, Daniel's heart pounded louder. He thought of his mounting debts, his failed investments, and the life he had always dreamed of but never attained. He needed this, he told himself. He deserved this. Then came the moment of betrayal. A swift push, a gasp, and a scream. Whitmore's cane clattered to the ground as his body plunged into the icy depths below. Daniel froze, his breath hitching as the splash echoed into the night. His pulse thundered in his ears, but his relief was short-lived. From the shadows of the nearby bushes, a faint rustling broke the silence. Hidden and unnoticed, Toby, Whitmore's loyal German shepherd, had been watching the entire scene unfold. His amber eyes gleamed with an almost human intensity as he stepped forward, his body taut and trembling. Daniel noticed the dog too late. His breath caught as Toby emerged, his gaze locked onto the man who had betrayed his master. For a fleeting moment, Daniel considered chasing the dog away. But there was something unnerving in Toby's presence, a quiet, watchful stillness that sent chills down his spine. Toby didn't bark, he didn't growl. He simply stood there, staring. And then, as if he understood the gravity of the situation, he turned and bolted into the darkness. Daniel stood frozen on the bridge, the sound of Toby's retreating paws fading into the distance. His mind was a whirlwind of panic and confusion. He replayed the moment over and over, the push, the scream, the splash, and now, the unexpected witness. A dog, he thought, just a dog. But why did the encounter feel so unnerving? Quickly, he snapped out of his daze. He couldn't stay here. With trembling hands, he picked up Whitmore's cane and hurled it over the edge of the bridge, watching as it disappeared into the river below. He took a deep breath, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and started the engine of his car. His plan wasn't perfect, but he had to stick to it. Back at Whitmore's sprawling estate, the absence of the old man would be noticed soon enough. Daniel needed to play the part of the concerned employee, devastated by his mentor's sudden disappearance. As he parked in the driveway, the imposing mansion seemed eerily quiet. Normally, Whitmore's voice would echo through the halls, calling for Toby or giving instructions to the staff. But tonight, the house felt empty, as if mourning its owner. Daniel stepped inside and rehearsed his lines. "I went looking for Mr. Whitmore," he whispered to himself. "He said he wanted some fresh air, and I couldn't find him." But as he entered the study, a low growl stopped him in his tracks. There, sitting by the fireplace, was Toby. The dog's coat, damp from the rain, clung to his muscular frame. His eyes glowed with a mixture of sadness and fury as he locked his gaze onto Daniel. The sight sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. "Toby," Daniel said cautiously, his voice trembling. He crouched slightly, trying to appear non-threatening. "Good boy. It's okay." But Toby didn't move. He didn't bark, nor did he bare his teeth. Instead, he sat there, his posture tense, his eyes never leaving Daniel's. It was as if he was silently accusing the man of his crime. Daniel felt a wave of unease wash over him. Animals didn't act like this, did they? Toby wasn't supposed to understand what had happened on that bridge. Or was he? Trying to shake off his discomfort, Daniel backed out of the room and closed the door. The next morning, the staff was already murmuring about Whitmore's disappearance. Daniel played his role convincingly, his voice trembling as he explained that Whitmore had gone out for a walk the night before and never returned. The police were called, and a search party was organized. But as the investigation began, Toby's behavior grew stranger. The dog followed Daniel everywhere, his amber eyes watching intently. At night, Daniel would hear the soft padding of paws outside his room, the occasional low growl echoing through the dark halls. He couldn't sleep, haunted not only by his guilt but also by the dog's unnerving presence. One evening, as the search for Whitmore stretched into its third day, a detective named Sarah Hayes arrived at the estate. She was sharp-eyed and quick-witted, with a reputation for solving even the most baffling cases. As she walked through the mansion, her attention was immediately drawn to Toby. "Beautiful dog," she remarked, kneeling to scratch behind his ears. Toby leaned into her touch, his demeanor softening for the first time in days. "He's loyal," Daniel said, forcing a smile. "He was Mr. Whitmore's pride and joy." Sarah studied the dog for a moment, her brow furrowing. "Loyalty like this often means they know more than we do," she said half-jokingly. But the comment struck a nerve in Daniel. As the days turned into weeks, the search for Whitmore yielded no results. The authorities began to suspect foul play, and Sarah's focus narrowed in on the people closest to him, particularly Daniel. Toby, meanwhile, became increasingly agitated. He would bark at the door whenever Daniel tried to leave and growl low and deep whenever he approached Whitmore's belongings. One night, as Daniel sat alone in the study, he heard a strange sound, a soft scratching at the window. His heart pounded as he turned to see Toby staring at him from the other side of the glass, his eyes glowing in the moonlight. It was as if the dog was challenging him, daring him to confess. Unable to take the pressure any longer, Daniel decided he needed to get rid of Toby. He couldn't focus with the dog constantly haunting him, reminding him of what he had done. Late one night, he loaded Toby into his car, driving deep into the woods. The dog sat silently in the passenger seat, his gaze fixed on Daniel. When they reached a remote clearing, Daniel opened the door and gestured for Toby to get out. "Go on," he said, his voice breaking. "You'll be fine out here." Toby hesitated, his eyes searching Daniel's face. Then, with a quiet whimper, he turned and disappeared into the trees. Daniel drove away, relieved to be free of the dog's accusatory presence. But deep down, he knew he hadn't seen the last of Toby. The woods were eerily quiet as Daniel drove away, his car cutting through the darkness like a blade. For the first time in days, he felt a faint sense of relief. Toby was gone, out of his life and out of his mind. Without the dog around, he thought he could finally start regaining control, but deep inside, a gnawing unease remained, like an ember refusing to die out. The next morning, Daniel awoke to the sound of loud knocking on his front door. His heart leapt in his chest, panic surging through him as his mind raced through worst-case scenarios. What if someone had found Whitmore? Or worse, what if someone had seen him at the bridge? Shaking the thought from his mind, he composed himself and opened the door to find Detective Sarah Hayes standing on the porch. "Good morning, Mr. Calloway," Sarah said, her sharp eyes scanning his face. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I have some updates on Mr. Whitmore's case." Daniel forced a polite smile, though his palms were clammy. "Not at all, Detective. Please, come in." As Sarah stepped into the house, she seemed to take in every detail, her gaze lingering on the faint scratches on the hardwood floors near the study, the spot where Toby used to sit. She didn't comment, but Daniel noticed her glance and shifted uncomfortably. "We've expanded our search radius. Sarah explained as she took a seat in the living room. "But I wanted to talk to you about something unusual. It's about Toby." Daniel's stomach dropped. "Toby?" he asked, feigning confusion. Sarah nodded, pulling a folder from her bag. "We found him, or rather he found us, early this morning. He showed up at the local sheriff's office. The deputies said he was sitting at the door, barking until someone let him in." Daniel's blood ran cold. He struggled to keep his expression neutral as Sarah continued. "Here's the strange part," she said, opening the folder. Inside was a photograph of Toby, sitting in the sheriff's office with something clutched in his mouth. It was a cane, a familiar cane, Whitmore's cane. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as Sarah placed the photo on the coffee table. "We're having it analyzed for prints," she said, her tone casual but her eyes razor-sharp. "It could help us determine what happened that night." Daniel stared at the photo, his mind racing. How had Toby found his way back? And why had he brought the cane? Was it instinct or something more deliberate? For the first time, he began to wonder if Toby's actions were more than just the behaviors of a loyal dog. "That's odd," Daniel said, his voice barely steady. "I thought Toby had run off after Mr. Whitmore disappeared." "Apparently not," Sarah replied, leaning back in her chair. "Animals have a way of surprising us, don't they?" The rest of the conversation passed in a blur. Sarah asked a few more questions about Whitmore's habits and their relationship, but Daniel could barely focus. His thoughts were consumed by the implications of Toby's return. When the detective finally left, he collapsed onto the couch, his head in his hands. But Daniel's reprieve was short-lived. Later that evening, as he paced the house, trying to think of his next move, a sound outside caught his attention, a low, steady growl. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing. Slowly, he moved to the window and peered out into the darkness. There, standing in the glow of the porch light, was Toby. His fur glistened in the damp air, and his amber eyes seemed to burn with an intensity that made Daniel's blood run cold. The dog didn't bark or move. He simply stared, as if waiting. Daniel backed away from the window, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. This couldn't be real. He had left Toby miles away in the woods. How had he found his way back so quickly? And why did it feel like the dog was trying to tell him something? In a moment of desperation, Daniel grabbed his phone and called Sarah. "Detective Hayes," he said, his voice shaking. "I think you should come back." "Toby, he's here." Sarah arrived within the hour, accompanied by an animal control officer. When they reached the porch, Toby was still there, sitting patiently as if he had been expecting them. Sarah crouched down, studying the dog closely. "Toby doesn't seem aggressive," she said, glancing at Daniel, "but he's definitely trying to communicate something." The animal control officer stepped forward, carefully leashing Toby and leading him to the truck. But as they prepared to leave, Toby began to bark furiously, pulling against the leash and looking back toward the house. "What is it, boy?" Sarah asked, following Toby's gaze. The dog whined and scratched at the ground, his behavior growing increasingly frantic. Curiosity piqued. Sarah gestured for the officer to let Toby go. The dog bolted toward the backyard, his nose to the ground as he sniffed with determination. Daniel watched helplessly as Toby led them to a patch of disturbed soil near the garden. "This doesn't look right," Sarah muttered, kneeling down. She began digging with her hands, the loose dirt giving way easily. Moments later, she uncovered something that made Daniel's heart stop. A small, mud-covered item came into view, a gold watch, and not just any watch. It was Whitmore's, unmistakable with its engraved initials. Sarah held the mud-caked watch in her hands, her brows furrowing as she inspected it under the beam of her flashlight. The engraved initials, J.W., gleamed faintly, confirming its ownership. She turned to Daniel, whose face had gone pale, his hands trembling by his sides. "This is Mr. Whitmore's, isn't it?" Sarah asked, her voice steady but probing. Daniel stammered, searching for a plausible explanation. I don't know. Maybe he dropped it before he disappeared." Sarah didn't reply immediately. Instead, she observed Daniel, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Toby, now sitting calmly by her side, seemed to mirror her intensity. his unwavering gaze locked onto Daniel. "Interesting," Sarah finally said, slipping the watch into an evidence bag. "We'll have to run some tests to see if there's anything useful. Soil composition, fingerprints, maybe even DNA." Daniel felt his chest tighten. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, but he knew that would only make him look guiltier. He had to keep playing along, pretending to be the concerned and cooperative employee. "Of course," he said, forcing a weak smile. "Anything to help find Mr. Whitmore." Sarah nodded, but her skepticism was palpable. "I appreciate your cooperation, Daniel. We'll be in touch soon." As she and the animal control officer prepared to leave, Toby hesitated. He looked back at Daniel one last time, his amber eyes filled with something that resembled both accusation and pity. Then he climbed into the truck without a sound, leaving Daniel alone with his mounting dread. That night, sleep eluded Daniel. The walls of the grand estate felt like they were closing in, suffocating him with their silence. Everywhere he turned, he saw reminders of Whitmore, his favorite chair by the fireplace, the portrait hanging in the study, even the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. But it wasn't just the house haunting him. It was Toby. The dog's piercing gaze replayed in his mind like a loop, each stare a silent condemnation. And then there was the watch. How had it ended up buried in the garden? He couldn't remember dropping it there, but in his panicked state that night, anything was possible. Daniel poured himself a stiff drink, hoping to calm his nerves. As the amber liquid burned its way down his throat, he tried to strategize his next move. He needed to cover his tracks, destroy any evidence that could link him to Whitmore's disappearance. The garden, he thought. If Sarah found the watch there, what else might she uncover? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He grabbed a flashlight and headed outside, determined to eliminate any loose ends. The garden was eerily quiet under the pale moonlight. Daniel worked quickly, digging through the soil near where the watch had been found. His hands trembled as he sifted through the dirt, searching for anything incriminating. But as he dug deeper, his flashlight caught something unexpected, a glint of metal. His heart raced as he unearthed the object, only to freeze in horror. It was a cufflink, engraved with the same initials as the watch, JW. Panic surged through him. How much had he dropped that night? Had he been so careless in his haste to cover up his crime? He stuffed the cufflink into his pocket, his mind racing with excuses for why it might be there. But then, a sound behind him made him freeze, the soft rustling of leaves, followed by a low, guttural growl. Slowly, he turned, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Standing at the edge of the garden was Toby. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. How was this possible? The dog had been taken to the rehabilitation center, yet here he was, his fur shimmering under the moonlight, his eyes burning with a fierce intensity. "How?" Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. Toby stepped forward, his movements deliberate and steady. He didn't bark or growl further. He simply stared, his gaze unwavering. It was as if the dog was challenging him, daring him to confess. Daniel backed away, his heart pounding. "Stay back!" he shouted, brandishing the flashlight like a weapon. "You're just a dog. You don't understand anything." But deep down, Daniel wasn't so sure. Toby's presence felt almost supernatural, as if he were a manifestation of Whitmore's lingering spirit. The dog's eyes seemed to pierce straight through him, stripping away his lies and exposing the truth. Unable to take it any longer, Daniel turned and fled back into the house, slamming the door behind him. He collapsed onto the floor, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. But the reprieve was short-lived. A sharp knock at the door jolted him upright. He hesitated, his mind racing with fear and paranoia. Finally, he opened it, only to find Sarah standing there, her expression grim. "We need to talk," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Daniel swallowed hard, his palms sweating. "Is something wrong, detective?" Sarah held up her phone, showing him a series of photos. "These were taken at the sheriff's office this evening," she said. Toby showed up again, this time with a piece of torn fabric in his mouth. "It looks like it came from a jacket, possibly yours." Daniel's blood ran cold. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. Sarah's eyes bore into him, her sharp instincts sensing his guilt. Daniel, she said quietly but firmly. "Was, is there something you're not telling me?" Daniel's mind was a storm of panic as Sarah's question hung in the air. Every instinct told him to deny everything, to double down on his innocence. But the mounting evidence and Toby's relentless actions made it clear that the walls were closing in. "I don't know what you mean," Daniel finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah sighed, her sharp eyes scanning his every movement. "Daniel, I've seen this before. People think they can hide the truth, but it always comes out. You might not want to tell me now, but Toby, he seems determined to do the talking for you." Daniel flinched at her words, the truth of them cutting deeper than she realized. How was it possible that a dog could seem so purposeful, so intent on exposing him? "I don't know why Toby is acting like this," he said, forcing a weak chuckle. "Maybe he's just confused without Whitmore around. Dogs don't understand things the way we do." Sarah tilted her head, studying him. "Don't underestimate animals, Daniel, especially ones like Toby. Loyalty like his doesn't fade easily." With that, she left, but not before giving him a parting warning. "We're not done here." And neither is Toby, apparently. That night, Daniel paced his room, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like a physical force. The torn fabric, the cufflink, the watch. It was as if every mistake he had made that night was coming back to haunt him. He poured himself another drink, trying to steady his nerves. But the alcohol did little to drown out the memories of the bridge, the splash of water, and Whitmore's panicked cries. As he sat in the dimly lit room, his phone buzzed on the table. It was an unknown number. Hesitant, he answered. "Daniel Calloway?" a gruff voice asked. "Yes, who is this?" The voice on the other end chuckled darkly. "Let's just say I know things about you, things you'd rather keep buried." Daniel's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" "You think no one saw what happened that night?" the voice continued. "Let's just say Toby isn't the only one watching you." Before Daniel could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone, his hands trembling. Who was this person? How could they know what he had done? The following day, Daniel received another unwelcome surprise. As he stepped outside to get the mail, he found a small package on the porch. It was unmarked, with no return address. Cautiously, he brought it inside and opened it. Inside was a small muddy object, a gold ring with Whitmore's initials engraved on the inside. Beneath it was a note scrawled in messy handwriting, "You can't run from the truth." Daniel's breath hitched as he stared at the ring. It was another piece of evidence tying him to Whitmore's disappearance, and now it was in his home. But the note suggested that someone else knew about it and was taunting him. Paranoia began to consume him. He double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, his eyes darting to every shadow and movement outside. Toby's absence should have brought him relief, but instead, it made him feel more exposed. Meanwhile, Sarah continued her investigation, piecing together the fragments of evidence that seemed to point toward Daniel. She visited the sheriff's office to review the items Toby had brought in, her suspicion deepening with each discovery. "It's almost like he's leading us to the answers," she remarked to the sheriff. "Or someone else is," and the sheriff replied, tapping the latest report from the forensics team. "That fabric Toby brought in. It matches Daniel Calloway's jacket." "We've confirmed it," Sarah nodded, the pieces falling into place. "It's not enough to charge him yet, but it's getting close. We need more." "Then maybe we should see what Toby does next," the sheriff suggested. Unbeknownst to Sarah, someone else was indeed pulling the strings. In the shadows, a figure watched Daniel's every move, their motives shrouded in mystery. They had seen what happened on the bridge that night, but instead of going to the authorities, they had chosen a more personal form of justice. This unknown witness had been the one to plant the ring on Daniel's porch, to call him in the dead of night. And now they were about to set their next plan into motion. That evening, Daniel was startled by the sound of breaking glass. He rushed to the kitchen to find a rock lying on the floor amidst a scattering of shards. Attached to it was another note, "You're running out of time." Panic overtook him. Who was doing this? Was it Sarah, the mysterious caller, or could Toby somehow be involved? The thought was absurd, yet the dog's actions had been anything but ordinary. As Daniel cleaned up the mess, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a text message. The sender was anonymous, but the message was chilling. "Meet me at the bridge tonight, or I'll tell everyone what I know." The darkness was suffocating as Daniel approached the bridge, his car creeping along the narrow, winding road. The location felt even more foreboding than it had on the night he had pushed Whitmore over the edge. The memory replayed in his mind with haunting clarity, the splash of water, the desperate cries that faded into silence. Now he was being dragged back to the scene of his crime, not by his own guilt, but by the chilling message from an anonymous tormentor. He parked his car at the edge of the bridge and stepped out, his heart pounding so loudly that it drowned out the rustling of the wind through the trees. The night was eerily quiet, save for the faint croaking of frogs from the river below. A lone figure emerged from the shadows, standing at the center of the bridge. Daniel strained to make out their features, but they were shrouded in darkness. "Who are you?" Daniel demanded, his voice trembling despite his attempt to sound composed. The figure took a step closer, their silhouette illuminated briefly by the faint moonlight. They wore a hooded jacket, and their face remained hidden. In their hand, they held something small and metallic, a flashlight, which they switched on and aimed at Daniel's face. "So you don't recognize me," the figure said, their voice distorted by a voice modulator. "I suppose that's fitting. You didn't care to look too closely that night either, did you?" Daniel's blood ran cold. "What do you want from me?" he asked, trying to mask the rising panic in his voice. "I want you to admit what you've done," the figure replied. "Say it out loud. Tell me how you killed Whitmore." "I don't know what you're talking about," Daniel stammered. "This is ridiculous," the figure laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Still lying even now, that's disappointing, Daniel, but you're running out of chances." With that, the figure tossed something onto the ground at Daniel's feet. He hesitated before bending down to pick it up, his fingers trembling. It was a USB drive. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Proof," the figure said simply. "Everything you did that night. I saw it. And if you don't come clean, the whole world will see it too." Daniel's knees threatened to give out as he clutched the drive in his hand. "Why are you doing this?" he pleaded. "What do you want from me?" The figure stepped closer, and for the first time Daniel caught a glimpse of their face, a young woman with piercing green eyes. She looked familiar, but he couldn't place her. "You don't even remember me, do you?" she said, her voice trembling with restrained anger. "My father worked for Whitmore. He was loyal, just like that dog of his. But you fired him when you came into power. You destroyed his life, just like you destroyed Whitmore's." Realization dawned on Daniel, but before he could respond, the woman continued. "I didn't come here to kill you, Daniel. I'm not like you, but I will make sure you pay for what you've done. If you don't confess by tomorrow morning, I'll release the video. And trust me, the police won't be the only ones knocking on your door." As the woman disappeared into the night, Daniel stood frozen on the bridge, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a physical force. He stumbled back to his car, his mind racing. He couldn't let the video go public. But what choice did he have? His options were dwindling, and the walls were closing in. When he arrived home, the first thing he did was insert the USB drive into his laptop. His hands trembled as he opened the file, the screen flickering to life with grainy footage of that fateful night. The video was shaky but clear enough to capture everything: the argument with Whitmore, the shove, the older man's desperate attempt to hold on, and finally, his fall into the icy water below. The damning evidence was undeniable. Daniel slammed the laptop shut, his breathing ragged. His mind raced with possibilities, but none of them offered a way out. Turning himself in felt like admitting defeat, but if he didn't, the video would destroy what little remained of his life. Meanwhile, Sarah was piecing together her own puzzle. The evidence against Daniel was mounting, but she needed more to make an arrest. She reviewed the items Toby had brought to the station: the watch, the torn fabric, the cufflink. Each one painted a clearer picture of what had happened, but it wasn't enough to secure a conviction. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. It read, "The bridge, midnight. Don't be late." The next morning, Daniel was jolted awake by the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly. He reached for it with a groggy hand, only to see a flood of notifications. His heart sank as he opened one of the messages. The video had been leaked. It was everywhere: social media, news outlets, even his email inbox. Panic consumed him as he realized the magnitude of what had happened. There was no hiding now. The world knew what he had done, and it was only a matter of time before the police arrived at his door. The morning sun cast its pale light over Daniel's estate, but the usual serenity was shattered by the chaos unfolding inside. Daniel sat slumped on his couch, his face buried in his hands. The video was everywhere now. Every major news outlet was running the story. His name splashed across headlines accusing him of murder. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages, but he ignored them all. He couldn't face the world, not yet. The loud banging on his front door jolted him upright. He froze, his breath hitching as the realization hit. It was only a matter of time before the police came for him. But when he peered through the window, he didn't see officers in uniform. Instead, he saw Sarah standing there, her expression a mix of determination and something he couldn't quite place. Was it pity? Reluctantly, Daniel opened the door. "Detective," he greeted her, his voice hollow. "So I assume you've seen the video?" Sarah stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "Everyone has," she said bluntly. "And it doesn't look good for you, Daniel." He slumped back into his seat, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want the truth," Sarah replied, pulling up a chair across from him. "That video might have leaked, but I need to hear it from you." "Why? What happened that night on the bridge?" For a moment, Daniel considered denying everything, but he knew it was futile. The video was irrefutable. There was no escaping the truth now. With a deep, shuddering breath, he began to speak. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," Daniel said, his voice trembling. "Whitmore and we argued. He accused me of trying to take over the company, of undermining him. He said I was ungrateful, that I owed everything to him." "And were you?" Sarah pressed. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Maybe I was, but he never saw me as an equal. He treated me like some lackey, even after years of working by his side. That night, I just wanted to make him understand that I deserved respect." He paused, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't mean to hurt him. I just wanted him to back off, to see that I wasn't afraid of him. But he lost his balance, and when he fell, I panicked. I didn't know what to do." Sarah studied him intently. "So you left him there, to drown?" Daniel's head dropped into his hands. "I thought maybe someone would find him in time, but I couldn't stay. I was scared." Outside, the hum of approaching vehicles broke the tense silence. Sarah glanced out the window to see police cars pulling up to the estate. She turned back to Daniel, her expression unreadable. "It's over, Daniel," as she said quietly. "They're here to take you in." Daniel didn't resist as the officers entered the house. He stood silently as they read him his rights, his hands trembling as they cuffed him. Sarah watched the scene unfold, her emotions a tumultuous mix of satisfaction and sorrow. She had solved the case, but it came at a cost, one she hadn't anticipated. As Daniel was escorted to the police car, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the driveway. Toby stood there, his golden coat gleaming in the sunlight, his eyes locked on Daniel. The dog didn't bark or growl. He simply stared, his presence a silent testament to the loyalty and justice that had ultimately unraveled Daniel's life. Sarah knelt beside Toby, running a hand through his fur. "You did good, boy," she murmured, "better than most humans could." Back at the station, Daniel sat in the interrogation room, his mind a haze of regret and despair. The leaked video had sealed his fate, but it also left him with unanswered questions. Who had recorded it, and why had they waited so long to release it? The answer came later that day, when Sarah received a tip from an anonymous source. A young woman, previously unidentified, had been spotted near the bridge on the night of Whitmore's death. When Sarah dug deeper, she found a connection between the woman and Whitmore's past employees. Her name was Emily Carter, the daughter of one of Whitmore's most loyal workers, fired by Daniel during a round of corporate cutbacks. Emily had been at the bridge that night, her phone capturing the damning footage. But instead of turning it over to the authorities immediately, she had chosen to bide her time, using it as leverage to ensure justice was served. As the pieces fell into place, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over yet. Emily's involvement had added another layer to the case, one that hinted at a deeper web of motives and consequences. But for now, the immediate threat had been neutralized. Daniel was in custody, and Toby's role in uncovering the truth had cemented his status as a hero. That evening, Sarah returned to the station to find Toby resting in his makeshift bed. She crouched beside him, her hand resting gently on his head. "Thank you, Toby," she said softly. "None of this would have been possible without you." Toby responded with a soft wag of his tail, his eyes closing as he drifted into a peaceful sleep. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a sense of closure. But she also knew that the ripples of this case would continue to spread, touching lives in ways she couldn't yet foresee. The days following Daniel's arrest brought a whirlwind of activity for Sarah and the team. The media frenzy surrounding the leaked video had escalated, and the public was clamoring for answers. But for Sarah, the story wasn't just about Daniel's crime. It was about the unseen threads that had led to this moment, and the people whose lives had been intertwined in ways they never could have predicted. At the rehabilitation center where Toby had been taken for a routine checkup, Sarah stood by as the veterinarian finished his examination. The dog had been through so much, witnessing his owner's death, tirelessly seeking justice, and now finding himself in the spotlight as a local hero. "He's in great health," the vet said, patting Toby on the head. "Size, whatever you're doing, keep it up." Sarah smiled, but her thoughts were elsewhere. As she watched Toby wag his tail, she couldn't help but think of the role he had played in uncovering the truth. Without him, Daniel might never have been caught. But one question lingered in her mind. What had driven Toby to act the way he did? Was it simply loyalty to Whitmore, or was there something deeper at play? Later that afternoon, Sarah received a call from Emily Carter. The young woman had avoided public attention since the video leaked, but now she wanted to meet. Sarah agreed, and they arranged to meet at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. When Sarah arrived, she found Emily sitting in a corner, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming cup of coffee. She looked nervous, her eyes darting around the room as if expecting someone to recognize her. "Emily?" Sarah asked gently as she approached the table. The young woman nodded, her grip on the cup tightening. "Thanks for meeting me," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'm glad you reached out," Sarah replied, taking a seat across from her. "I've been trying to piece everything together, and I think you might have some answers." Emily hesitated, her gaze dropping to the table. "I didn't mean for things to get this far," she said. "So I couldn't let him get away with it." "You did the right thing by coming forward," Sarah assured her. "But why wait? Why not go to the police right away?" Emily took a shaky breath. "I was scared. My dad. He always said Whitmore was a good man. When he got fired, it broke him. And then I heard about what happened on the bridge. I didn't know what to do at first, but when I saw the way Toby acted, how determined he was, I realized I had to do something. It felt like I owed it to him." As the conversation continued, Emily revealed more about her father's connection to Whitmore and the sense of betrayal he had felt after being fired. She had grown up hearing stories about Whitmore's kindness and generosity, and seeing Daniel's cold, calculated behavior had ignited a desire for justice. "I followed Daniel that night," Emily admitted, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to, but when I saw him arguing with Whitmore, I knew something was wrong. I hid behind the trees and started recording on my phone. When Whitmore fell, I froze. I didn't know what to do." Sarah listened intently, her respect for the young woman growing with every word. Emily's bravery in capturing the video and eventually coming forward had been crucial in solving the case. "What will you do now?" Sarah asked as they finished their conversation. Emily shrugged, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know. I just hope this brings some peace to Whitmore's family and to Toby. He deserves that much." Meanwhile, at the station, the sheriff reviewed the evidence one last time before submitting it to the prosecutor's office. The case against Daniel was airtight, thanks to the combined efforts of Sarah, Toby, and Emily. But as he filed the final report, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. "Sarah," he called as she walked into his office. "Got a minute?" She nodded and took a seat. "We've got Daniel." and the evidence is solid, he said. But there's still the matter of Whitmore's will. Did you know he had recently updated it? Sarah frowned. No, I didn't. Why? The sheriff handed her a document. Turns out, Whitmore left almost everything to Toby. His estate, his savings, even the company shares. It's all in trust, managed by an animal welfare organization. Daniel knew about it, found out just a week before Whitmore's death. The revelation hit Sarah like a bolt of lightning. Daniel's motive had just become crystal clear. Killing Whitmore hadn't just been about anger or power, it had been about money. Whitmore's decision to leave his fortune to Toby had been the final insult, the one Daniel couldn't tolerate. That evening, Sarah visited the rehabilitation center again. She found Toby in his enclosure, happily chewing on a bone. As she sat down beside him, she couldn't help but marvel at the twists and turns the case had taken. "You really are something special," she said, scratching behind his ears. "Not many people could do what you've done." Toby wagged his tail, his eyes gleaming with affection. In that moment, Sarah felt a sense of closure. The case wasn't just about solving a crime, it was about honoring the bond between a man and his dog, and the loyalty that had ultimately brought the truth to light. As Daniel sat alone in his holding cell, the weight of his actions pressed down on him like an unrelenting tide. The walls felt as though they were closing in, the silence only broken by the occasional distant sound of keys jangling or officers passing by. He had once been a man of power, wealth, and influence. Now, he was nothing more than an inmate awaiting his reckoning. Meanwhile, at the police station, Sarah was piecing together the final threads of the case. With Whitmore's will now in their possession and Emily's testimony officially recorded, the narrative was complete. But Sarah knew that this wasn't just about solving a crime. It was about justice for Whitmore, for Toby, and for all the lives Daniel's greed had affected. Late that evening, Sarah found herself back at the station, going through the evidence one last time. She pulled out a photo of Whitmore and Toby, taken just a few weeks before his death. The older man's warm smile and the dog's loyal gaze were a stark contrast to the cold, calculated expression Daniel wore in his mugshot. It was a reminder of what was truly at stake. Her thoughts were interrupted by a call from the sheriff. "Sarah, we've got a situation," he said, his tone urgent. "You need to get down to the holding area." When Sarah arrived, she found chaos. Daniel was pacing his cell, shouting at the top of his lungs. "You don't understand," he yelled. "I didn't do it for the money. He deserved it." The officers were trying to calm him down, but Sarah stepped in, her voice firm. "Daniel, enough," she commanded. "You've already confessed." "What are you trying to accomplish now?" Daniel stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes wild. "You think you know everything, don't you?" he spat. "But you don't understand the whole story." "Then tell me," Sarah said, crossing her arms. "What am I missing?" For a moment, Daniel hesitated, his expression wavering between anger and desperation. Then he began to speak, his voice low and trembling. "Whitmore. He wasn't the man everyone thought he was," Daniel said. "Sure, he was kind to Toby, but to everyone else, he was ruthless. He didn't care about the company or the people who worked for him. All he cared about was his legacy, his name." Sarah frowned. "That doesn't justify what you did, Daniel. Killing him didn't fix anything." Daniel shook his head, his hands gripping the bars of his cell. "You don't get it. He humiliated me. He made sure I'd never be his equal. And then he left everything to that dog. That was the final insult. He treated me like I was worthless, like I didn't matter." His voice broke, and for the first time, Sarah saw a flicker of vulnerability beneath his arrogance. "I didn't mean to kill him," Daniel whispered. "I just wanted to make him listen." As Daniel's confession echoed in the small room, Sarah felt a pang of pity for the man before her. But pity didn't change the facts. Whitmore was dead, and Daniel's actions had set a series of events into motion that could never be undone. "Fine, Daniel. Whatever your reasons were, they don't excuse what you did," Sarah said firmly. "You made a choice, and now you have to live with the consequences." Back at the rehabilitation center, Toby was becoming restless. Despite the progress he had made in adapting to his new surroundings, there was a sense of unease in the air. The staff noticed his behavior and attributed it to the lingering effects of the case. But Sarah, who had returned to check on him, saw something deeper. Sitting by Toby's enclosure, Sarah spoke softly to the dog. "You've done so much already," she said, "but I think there's still more you want to tell us, isn't there?" Toby's ears perked up, his intelligent eyes locking onto hers. He let out a soft bark, almost as if in agreement. It was a reminder of the bond that had driven him to uncover the truth, a bond that Sarah was determined to honor. The next morning, Emily arrived at the station to provide a final piece of evidence, Whitmore's journal, which she had found while clearing out her father's old belongings. The journal contained detailed entries about his plans for the company, his love for Toby, and his growing mistrust of Daniel. One entry, dated just days before his death, read, "Daniel's ambition is dangerous. I fear he's willing to go to great lengths to secure power, even at the expense of others. I must protect Toby and ensure the company's future remains secure." The journal was a damning piece of evidence, solidifying Daniel's motive and painting a clear picture of the events leading up to the murder. For Sarah, it was the final puzzle piece. Later that day, as Sarah stood in the courtroom watching Daniel's arraignment, she felt a mix of emotions: relief that justice was being served, sadness for Whitmore and the life that had been cut short, and hope for Toby, whose loyalty had brought the truth to light. As Daniel was led away in handcuffs, Sarah caught a glimpse of Emily sitting in the gallery, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Their eyes met, and Emily nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had shared. The courtroom was heavy with tension as the trial continued. Daniel's confession, the leaked video, and now Whitmore's journal had painted a picture of betrayal and ambition turned deadly. Yet, there was an air of anticipation as the jury deliberated. For Sarah, who sat in the gallery beside Emily and Whitmore's distant relatives, the wait felt interminable. Toby wasn't present, but his role in the case loomed large. The prosecutor had used his loyalty and actions as a symbol of justice and truth, an embodiment of the bond between man and animal. As the prosecutor had argued, Toby didn't just witness the crime, he ensured the truth saw the light of day. That's a loyalty no one can put a price on. The courtroom was heavy with tension as the trial continued. Daniel's confession, the leaked video, and now Whitmore's journal had painted a picture of betrayal and ambition turned deadly. Yet, there was an air of anticipation as the jury deliberated. For Sarah, who sat in the gallery beside Emily and Whitmore's distant relatives, the wait felt interminable. Toby wasn't present, but his role in the case loomed large. The prosecutor had used his loyalty and actions as a symbol of justice and truth, an embodiment of the bond between man and animal. As the prosecutor had argued, Toby didn't just witness the crime, he ensured the truth saw the light of day. That's a loyalty no one can put a price on. As the jury returned to deliver the verdict, the courtroom fell silent. Daniel sat rigid, his expression unreadable, though his fingers twitched nervously. The foreperson stood, clearing her throat before speaking the words that everyone had been waiting for. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Daniel Carter, guilty of second-degree murder." Gasps echoed through the room, followed by whispers and murmurs. Daniel's face fell, his composure finally cracking as he slumped in his seat. For Sarah, it was a bittersweet moment. Justice had been served, but the cost was undeniable. After the verdict, Sarah stepped outside the courthouse, the fresh air a welcome reprieve from the suffocating atmosphere inside. She found Emily standing near the steps, staring at the horizon. "It's over," Emily said, her voice barely audible. "For now," Sarah replied. "Sir, but you know as well as I do that this case will leave ripples. There's still work to be done." Emily turned to her, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What kind of work?" "Whitmore's journal hinted at more than just Daniel's betrayal," Sarah explained. "There's a whole network of corruption in the company, people who turned a blind eye to Daniel's actions or enabled them. If we want real justice, we can't stop here." Meanwhile, at the rehabilitation center, Toby was adjusting to his new life. The staff had taken special care to create a comfortable environment for him, but his bond with Sarah was undeniable. He often perked up at the sound of her voice, and when she visited, his tail wagged with unrestrained joy. On this particular day, Sarah brought Emily along. "I thought it was time you met the real hero of this story," Sarah said as Toby bounded over to greet them. Emily knelt down, her eyes welling up with tears as she scratched behind Toby's ears. "You're incredible, you know that," she whispered. "You're the reason we're here today." Toby licked her hand, his warm, loyal gaze a silent acknowledgement of her words. As the day wore on, Sarah and Emily discussed the next steps. Sarah's plan to investigate the corruption within Whitmore's company was ambitious but necessary. "If we want to honor Whitmore's legacy," Sarah said, "we have to root out the rot. That means holding everyone accountable, not just Daniel." Emily hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of a photo she had brought, a picture of Whitmore and her father standing proudly in front of the company's headquarters. "I'll help," she said finally. "My dad believed in Whitmore's vision. If there's a chance to protect that, I'll do whatever it takes." That evening, Sarah returned to her office to compile her findings. The case against Daniel might be closed, but her instincts told her that there was more to uncover. Whitmore's journal contained cryptic references to meetings and deals that didn't add up, and Sarah was determined to follow the trail. She opened her laptop and began sifting through files, her mind racing with possibilities. But as she worked, a notification popped up on her screen, an email from an anonymous source. The subject line read, "There's more you need to know." Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she clicked on the email. Attached was a document detailing a series of transactions between Whitmore's company and a shell corporation. The dates lined up with the timeline of Daniel's betrayal, but the amounts were staggering, millions of dollars funneled into accounts with no clear purpose. "This isn't over," Sarah muttered to herself, her resolve hardening. She knew she was on the brink of something much bigger than she had anticipated. At the same time, Daniel sat in his prison cell, staring at the blank walls. His mind replayed the events leading up to Whitmore's death, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like a physical force. He thought of Toby, the loyal dog who had been the key to his downfall, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of remorse. But remorse wouldn't change his fate. Daniel knew he had lost everything, his freedom, his reputation, and the chance to make amends. All that remained was the cold, unyielding reality of the choices he had made. The air in Sarah's office was thick with anticipation as she reviewed the files sent by the anonymous source. The evidence pointed to a shadowy network within Whitmore's company that had been operating in secret for years. Hidden bank accounts, offshore transactions, and coded messages painted a picture of corruption that went far beyond Daniel's actions. Meanwhile, at the rehabilitation center, Toby was restless. It was as if he sensed that the story wasn't over, that there was still a wrong to be righted. Sarah, who had arrived late to visit him, sat beside his enclosure, her laptop balanced on her knees. "You always know when there's more to uncover, don't you?" she said, scratching behind his ears. Toby let out a soft bark, his eyes gleaming with intelligence. Sarah had spent the past 48 hours unraveling the threads of the new evidence. The anonymous tip had led her to a name, Robert Langston, a senior executive in Whitmore's company. Langston had worked closely with Whitmore for decades, but the documents suggested he had been orchestrating a scheme to embezzle funds and frame Whitmore for financial mismanagement. "He's the one who pulled the strings," Sarah murmured, staring at Langston's name on the screen. And Daniel was just another pawn in his game. The following day, Sarah called a meeting with Emily and the sheriff. The stakes had never been higher. "Yeah, we've got enough to implicate Langston," she explained, spreading out the documents on the table. "But we need to move quickly. If he gets wind of this, he'll disappear, and we'll lose our chance to bring him to justice." The sheriff nodded grimly. "We'll need a warrant and a team to bring him in, but we'll also need to make sure this doesn't leak to the press until we have him in custody." Emily, though nervous, was resolute. "What can I do to help?" "Be ready to testify," Sarah said. "Your father's connection to Whitmore and your role in exposing Daniel's crime make you a key witness. Langston's lawyers will try to discredit us, but your testimony will make it harder for them to wiggle out." That evening, the team mobilized. The sheriff and his officers secured the warrant, while Sarah and Emily prepared the evidence for presentation. By the time they reached Langston's sprawling estate on the outskirts of town, the tension was palpable. The operation was swift and efficient. Officers surrounded the property, ensuring there was no escape. Langston, who had been enjoying an evening drink on his terrace, looked stunned as the police approached. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice dripping with indignation. "Robert Langston, you're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy," the sheriff announced, his tone unwavering. "You have the right to remain silent." Langston's protestations fell on deaf ears as the officers escorted him to a waiting vehicle. For Sarah, it was a moment of triumph, but also a reminder of the lengths people would go to for power and greed. As Langston was taken into custody, Sarah and Emily returned to the station to finalize the case. The evidence against Langston was overwhelming, and with his arrest, the full scope of the corruption within Whitmore's company began to emerge. It became clear that Langston had manipulated Daniel, feeding his insecurities and ambitions to turn him against Whitmore. "He played everyone," Sarah said, her voice tinged with anger. "Whitmore trusted him, and he used that trust to line his own pockets." Emily nodded, her expression somber. "At least now we know the truth. And we can make sure no one else suffers because of him." At the rehabilitation center, Toby seemed to sense the shift in the air. When Sarah visited him the next morning, he greeted her with enthusiastic barks and a wagging tail. "How he did it, Toby," Sarah said, crouching down to meet his gaze. "Whitmore's legacy is safe, thanks to you." The bond between them had grown even stronger over the course of the case. Toby's unwavering loyalty and sharp instincts had been the cornerstone of their success, and Sarah couldn't imagine her life without him. In the weeks that followed, the story of Whitmore, Daniel, and Langston captured national attention. The media praised Sarah, Emily, and the sheriff for their dedication to uncovering the truth, but it was Toby who became the symbol of the case. The loyal German shepherd's bravery and intelligence inspired countless people, and he was celebrated as a hero. Emily, now more confident and determined than ever, decided to continue her father's work. With Sarah's help, she launched an initiative to honor Whitmore's vision, focusing on ethical business practices and community support. As for Sarah, she found herself drawn back to the rehabilitation center time and time again. Toby had become more than just a part of the case, he had become a part of her life. One sunny afternoon, as they played in the center's yard, she made a decision. "I see Toby," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "How would you like to come home with me?" Toby barked excitedly, his tail wagging furiously. It was as if he understood exactly what she meant. In the final moments of the case, as Sarah stood in her backyard watching Toby chase a ball, she reflected on everything they had been through. The betrayal, the loss, the pursuit of justice. It had all led to this moment. And though the journey had been difficult, it had also been worth it. Sometimes, she thought, it's the most unexpected bonds that change our lives forever. The sun was setting over the town as Sarah sat on her porch, Toby lying contentedly at her feet. The gentle rustling of leaves and the soft chirping of birds filled the air, a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed their lives in the weeks prior. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was peace. Whitmore's company, once tainted by corruption, was now in the hands of Emily and a newly appointed team of ethical leaders. Emily had worked tirelessly to honor her father's legacy, ensuring that the company would stand as a symbol of integrity and community support. One of her first initiatives was to create a scholarship fund in Whitmore's name, aimed at helping underprivileged youth pursue their dreams. At the scholarship fund's launch event, Emily stood at the podium, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "My father believed in second chances," she said. "He believed in lifting others up, in giving them the tools to succeed. This fund is our way of carrying on his mission and ensuring that his vision lives on." The audience erupted into applause, their admiration evident. Among them was Sarah, watching with pride. She knew how much this moment meant to Emily and felt grateful to have played a part in making it possible. Back at the rehabilitation center, Toby was thriving. The staff had officially declared him ready for adoption, though everyone knew there was only one person who could truly give him the home he deserved. Sarah, who had grown inseparable from Toby, wasted no time in finalizing the adoption. The day she brought Toby home was a celebration in itself. Friends and colleagues gathered to welcome him, showering him with treats and toys. "You've earned this, buddy," Sarah said, kneeling to hug him. Toby wagged his tail furiously, his eyes sparkling with happiness. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah and Toby settled into a new routine. Their days were filled with walks in the park, quiet evenings on the porch, and the occasional trip to the rehabilitation center to visit old friends. Toby had become a local hero, and children often stopped Sarah on the street to pet him and hear his story. One crisp autumn morning, Sarah received an unexpected letter. The envelope bore the logo of an animal rights organization, and inside was an invitation to speak at an upcoming conference. The theme: Unbreakable Bonds, the role of animals in justice and healing. Sarah hesitated at first. Public speaking wasn't her strong suit, but as she looked down at Toby, who was gazing up at her with his usual mix of loyalty and curiosity, she knew she couldn't refuse. This was an opportunity to share their story and inspire others. The conference was held in a grand auditorium, filled with activists, law enforcement officials, and animal lovers from around the world. As Sarah stepped onto the stage, Toby trotted beside her, earning a wave of applause and cheers from the audience. Taking a deep breath, Sarah began. "This is Toby," she said, her voice steady but warm. "He's not just a dog, he's a hero. Together, we uncovered the truth behind a terrible crime, and in doing so, we forged a bond that changed both our lives forever." She spoke about Whitmore's case, the challenges they faced, and the lessons they learned. She emphasized the importance of recognizing animals as sentient beings capable of extraordinary loyalty and courage. "Toby didn't just help us solve a case," Sarah concluded. "He reminded us of the power of trust, love, and determination." The audience gave her a standing ovation, their admiration palpable. After the talk, countless people approached Sarah to thank her and share their own stories of animal companionship. It was a moment of connection and hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is light. As Sarah and Toby drove home that evening, she felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't experienced in years. The case, the trial, the revelations, it had all been worth it. But more than anything, she felt grateful for Toby, whose unwavering loyalty had been the cornerstone of their journey. Back at home, Sarah placed a new nameplate on Toby's collar. It read, "Toby, the Loyal Hero." She smiled as she fastened it around his neck. "Oh, that's who you are," she said, scratching behind his ears. Toby wagged his tail, leaning into her touch. In the days that followed, life returned to its usual rhythm. Sarah continued her work as a detective, but now with a renewed sense of purpose. She and Emily remained close, often collaborating on community projects inspired by Whitmore's vision. Toby, ever the loyal companion, became a fixture at Sarah's side. Whether they were solving a case, visiting the park, or simply enjoying a quiet evening at home, he was always there, a reminder of the journey they had shared and the bond that had brought them together. As the story of Whitmore, O'Danielis and Toby faded from the headlines, it left behind a legacy of hope and resilience. People across the country were inspired by the tale of a loyal German shepherd who had helped uncover the truth and bring justice to a grieving family. For Sarah, the journey wasn't just about solving a case, it was about finding something she hadn't realized she was missing. In Toby, she had found not just a partner, but a friend, a protector, and a constant source of joy. Sitting on her porch one evening, watching the sunset with Toby at her feet, Sarah thought about everything they had been through. "We make a pretty good team, don't we?" she said softly. Toby barked in agreement, his tail wagging as if to say, "The best." Did you enjoy this story? Do you believe in the power of loyalty and the bond between humans and animals? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories like this one. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.